Legends and Lattes is the first fiction book that I've actually been able to read for fun. Before I started bookbinding, I had a complicated relationship with books. I have Irlen syndrome, a learning disability similar to dyslexia, where words seem to dance across the page. It makes reading frustrating at best, and completely impossible if there's a distraction. As a result of this, school crushed any ability for me to love books. Even when I wanted to read, there was always a mountain of homework and mandatory reading assignments staring at me from the corner of my room, assignments I almost never completed. It created a mixture of dread and guilt that felt impossible to ignore whenever I tried to open a book. It's no surprise that when I walked out of school, I didn't pick up a book for another decade. What's more surprising is that I managed to achieve the perfectly average grades that I did. Recently, however, I've been forced to confront this very mild trauma. I started sharing my bookbinding projects online and built a modest following of wonderfully bookish people. They so obviously found joy, comfort, and creativity in the literary worlds that they visited. At first, I felt insecure and embarrassed, like an imposter that they would inevitably uncover. What if they found my dirty secret, that I, a bookbinder, didn't actually read any books? But somewhere along the line, those feelings turned into jealousy. I longed for that same sense of joy that others found in reading. To find it, I realized that I'd need to challenge this aversion to reading that I've carried since my formative years. I'm no longer in school. That pile of homework is gone. The only thing stopping me is myself. Of course, I still have my learning disability, but it's not the barrier it once was. With adulthood comes awareness of my own limitations, but also knowledge of the different coping mechanisms available to me. Not to mention, I have managed just fine doom scrolling for hours on my phone for many years. So maybe the proliferation of ebooks and audiobooks in the marketplace since my time in school will have made things easier. After some research and some talks with friends and my brother Rob, I settled on Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. I didn't want a massive universe with a million plot threads to track. I just wanted something low stakes and cozy that I wouldn't find intimidating. The fact that it's centered around coffee, a personal special interest of mine, was a huge plus. This book fit the bill exactly. Some even say that it invented the cozy fantasy genre altogether, although I've heard the author Travis humbly rebut that with examples like Terry Pratchett. This is the part of my rebind where things started to run into issues. Until this point, you've seen me preparing the text block ready for the custom cover, and everything has gone off without a hitch. No project is without its hiccups though, especially when ambitious makers like me try too many new techniques all at once. I've just printed out the bulk of my cover design on a new material to me, a coated canvas material used for making those photograph canvases that were popular in the 2010s. It seems like this material might hold up well as a bookcloth that I can print illustrated covers straight onto with my inkjet, and for the most part that's true, but coupled with trying toner foil for the first time on a laser printer that has a fault with its charge drum, well, that's a recipe for disaster. I spent the whole evening toiling with this issue. I had to mask off the area of the page where the printer kept putting down streams of dots, but all of my attempts seemed to jam. And even when they didn't completely jam, they caused issues while running the foil through the laminator. On the last attempt, I almost made it, but the masking tape that I'd decided to stick directly to the cover seemed to warp the page unevenly while it was heated in the laminator. This warping caused a large crease down the center of the page. That was the last straw in my frustrating evening, and I walked away from the project to sleep and think things over. The next day, I decided to give up on the toner foil for now. There are many different ways to add foil to a book cover. Traditionally, you would use a hot tool and a real metal foil to press gold or silver straight into the cover. Then came heat-reactive foils that melt a synthetic foil onto the page using a hot melt adhesive and a hot tool similar to the traditional technique, but at a much lower cost. Toner foil is very similar to heat-reactive foil, but it forgoes the adhesive and uses laser printer toner. This lets you print out any design without specialized tools. You simply run your pre-printed design through a laminator with the synthetic foil, and the heat from the laminator remelts the toner, grabbing onto the foil wherever your design is printed. This gives you really intricate foil designs without the headache of making or buying expensive stamps. The last option I have access to is heat transfer vinyl. It's one of the newer techniques that's really seen a rise in recent years with consumer-grade vinyl cutters like the Cricut. It's not my favourite material, as it's not very durable and the shine just doesn't look as nice to me, but it's really accessible and easy to apply, and the project just needs to get moving, so vinyl it is. I listened to the audiobook of Legends Lattes while embroidering for an upcoming project, and if it wasn't for my husky Tundra reminding me that she needs food and walks, I would have inhaled the entire 7 hours in one sitting. Travis started out as a narrator for audiobooks, and I think that really shines through. I've tried audiobooks in the past and always got distracted, but Travis does a brilliant job of keeping the listener immersed. Pairing it with the just mundane enough task of embroidery helped me focus perfectly. The story is just very wholesome and nice. I found some reviews calling it boring and slow, but I don't agree. The book has a richness that isn't in a complex plot or sprawling universe. It's in the deep relationships between characters that you end up feeling a part of. It's the ease with which you develop these connections with the characters that actually undermines the low-stakes claim a little for me. When the big bad does come around, you feel a genuine concern for the characters and a satisfying sense of relief when the crisis is resolved. I've decided to forgive this little white lie on the cover of the book though, because if there weren't any stakes at all, the narrative arc would just fall flat. I'm so glad that this book found me when it did. I relate a lot to the main character Viv, who's starting out in a new town and leaving behind the life that she and society expected of her. Every time Viv had to explain her new venture to an inquisitive but skeptical stranger, I got flashes of trying to convince others in my own life of my hopes for my bookbinding business. But more importantly, I'm starting to feel the parallels between me and Viv setting down roots in a new community and building relationships with people who help lessen the burdens of day-to-day life. I hope for my own sake that this is where the parallels end, but I feel sure that if I were to face a crisis like Viv's, that this book-loving community I found myself settling into by chance would show me the same level of support that Viv found in the city of Foon. For the first time that I can remember, I wasn't struggling for a book that I wasn't invested in. I was transported into a new world, and I loved it. This book was the perfect introduction to reading for fun. I'm not a seasoned reviewer, and my rating, with a sample size of exactly one book, is hardly prestigious. But I feel it's impossible to rate this book at anything lower than 5 stars. The project is finally getting into the end stages now. I've just 3D printed and I'm in the process of painting a miniature model of a coffee mug. I've been playing with this concept in my mind for a while now, with the hopes that attaching a 3D printed model to a cover could give a small sort of diorama effect, and I'm pleased to say that it does. I'd hoped that the colour changing filament I used for this part would let me get away without doing any painting, but it's such a small amount of plastic that the gradient didn't have a chance to change at all. This is my first real attempt at using acrylic paint. I had to steal these supplies from my fiancée, but I think it turned out good, and it's more convincing than the filament would ever have been. I had complete control of the colours and even got to add little touches like marbling the coffee foam. I'll certainly be dipping into the paints again for future projects. Finishing the painted surface with a gloss varnish really gives the impression of a ceramic glaze. I repeated this touch on the back lip of the mug that's printed on the cover. This helps sell the 3D effect and makes it appear like the glaze wraps around to the part of the mug that's pressed against the paper. This is actually the first project I've ever used vinyl on. I've had my Cricut almost 10 years now, and only used it for cutting paper or card, and more recently for hot foil stamping with the foil quill. All the cuts went smoothly, and the only issue I had was the first application with the iron. I used a sheet of standard copy paper to protect the cover from the heat of the iron, but the ink seemed to stick to the paper and lift when I pulled the paper away. I also had some minor issues with some letters coming away with the transfer film, but when I switched to using silicone parchment paper and got better at heating the vinyl, the rest of the transfers went well. I filled in the lifted ink with some pens and blended different colours until it looked right. I was fortunate that I designed this cover with a gradient and a slight chalkboard effect to mimic the menu from Viv's Cafe. This lets me disguise any imperfections really easily. It was then a matter of quickly cutting the missing letters and ironing those on. When I'm happy with the foil, I move on to casing in the text block. This went really smoothly without a wrinkled end paper in sight, and after a night in the press, I was finally at the last step, gluing the coffee mug down. I used a two-pronged technique for this. PVA glue grabs really fast and is very strong, but it can sometimes be a little brittle, and any squeeze out will be very visible on the cover as it's very glossy when dry. To get around this, I only used PVA in the center of the part to grab quickly. And then around the edges I used matte acrylic gel medium. This isn't conventionally used as an adhesive, but it does work. It's much slower to dry, but it has a matte finish that is very difficult to see when it sets, and it's very flexible, which should help prevent the part cracking away if the boards ever warp or move over time. I press this part onto the cover using a sponge to conform to the curved surface and a board to help even the pressure out. This is pressed down between my desk and a sturdy shelf using a woodworking clamp in spreading mode. Now that the glue has set on this final touch, it's on to the reveal. This story really whetted my appetite, and I'm excited to see what worlds I can dive into next. If you've got any recommendations for my next read, please drop them in the comments below. I'd love to start building my TBR list with you. Thank you so much to Travis for writing this wonderful story, and to you for watching. See you next time.